So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Yeah.
The catastrophic harm that could arise from any use of nuclear weapons led to United Nations member countries working together to negotiate a treaty that would ban them completely in July 2017. ICANN worked with academics and activists at the meetings in New York to help get it passed. We even won the Nobel Peace Prize for that work. So, can you tell us a little bit about what it is that the treaty actually bans?
Yeah, sure. So I actually do and have next to me my trusty personal copy of the treaty here, so I can tell you. I mean, it's the list of prohibitions is quite comprehensive, obviously, but it says, develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, transfer, receive, transfer or control of nuclear weapons, use or threaten to use, of course, assist, encourage, induce, seek or receive any assistance in any way to any prohibited act under the treaty, allowing the stationing, installation, or deployment of any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive devices in its territory at any place under its jurisdiction or control. So basically, the whole gamut of activities that a country could, engage with on nuclear weapons. So it's not just about using nuclear weapons, not just about possessing nuclear weapons, but also kind of being complicit with those activities in any way.
Thanks for going through all that. Do you think that that contributed to why so many countries wanted to see the treaty adopted?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was this phrase prior to the negotiation in 2017 that had been floating around for a few years, arising out of the so-called humanitarian initiative, this move to raise awareness around the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And as that process evolved and gathered steam, this kind of phrase emerged, and that was this kind of the existence of a legal gap as it concerns nuclear weapons. And what that meant was that unlike other weapons of mass destruction, like chemical or biological weapons, unlike other weapons that are considered unacceptable or weapons that should be banned because of their indiscriminate effects, like cluster munitions or anti-personnel landmines, there was no comprehensive categorical prohibition on nuclear weapons. Obviously, we have had for many years the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is of course extremely important and regulates nuclear weapons, significantly, and has been quite successful in many areas related to nuclear weapons. But that is not, as we know, a prohibition on nuclear weapons as such. So I think the idea of closing that legal gap was something that that I think states, really resonated with states, especially, as we explain to them what the actual concrete implications of that could be on the nuclear weapon states, even if, as we, anticipated, even if they didn't join the negotiation of the treaty.
So, for the implications on the nuclear weapon states, like what are the impacts for the governments that don't sign it?
Yeah, so I think it's important. It's an important question, and it's one that we get a lot, and we shouldn't really shy away from it or kind of beat around the bush. I mean, in legal terms, a treaty, like a contract in private law, harkening back to my my law studies, it's only legally binding on the countries that sign or ratify it and become what's known as states parties to the treaty. So once once we reach that 50 and the treaty enters into force, as it's called, only those countries that have signed and ratified are considered states parties. But of course, I think for ICANN and civil society in general, and as in addition to the support of governments, we wouldn't have embarked on this journey to ban nuclear weapons if it wouldn't have an impact on the main offenders themselves, as well as their allies under the so-called nuclear umbrella. So, as someone who studied law, obviously I find the creation of law quite significant, but that doesn't mean that that's the end in and of itself. It's not just about creating a new treaty. It's about the importance and the resonance, the impact that treaty can have on state practice. And this is something where you hear that term, a normative impact. the normative impact that international law and treaties have on state behaviors, and not just states themselves, but also sub-state actors as well. So I think past practice has shown that to be quite effective, and an example that is often used, and something that was inspiring for ICANN as a campaign, was the experience with cluster munitions, and previous to that, anti-personnel landmines. So we saw with those initiatives that, you know, the states, the main offenders, were not, the states that possess those weapons were not at all in favor of prohibiting them, and they made many of the same arguments that we hear today with nuclear weapons. They claimed things like these were, you know, integral for military purposes. They're, you know, essential for national defense in some situations. And, you know, the states that were the biggest producers, including the United States and Russia, the main producers of those weapons, did not join those treaties. But, you know, nevertheless, we've seen over the last you know, decade that cluster munitions, for example, are no longer in any way seen to be an acceptable weapon to have in arsenal. That's not to say that they haven't been used. There have been, of course, instances of usage of cluster munitions, reports in Yemen, for example. But by and large, you see states moving away from those weapons because they're considered to be, you know, they're considered to be a bit, I mean, taboo, stigmatized. You know, they're not something that is considered to be an appropriate means of conducting warfare, if ever there is such a thing. And I think, in addition to that, what you see is industry, the producers, the private producers of those weapons also choose to move away from those, from producing those weapons. So in 2000, I want to say 2014, 2015, but you might want to look that up, was the last company in the United States. It was called Textron, a major arms producer. They were the last company in 2014, 15 to announce that they were going to stop building cluster munitions, and that was precisely because of what they saw was an unfavorable environment, you know, lack of a market for it. And that's, you know, because of the existence of that the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So if we use those examples, just, you know, cluster munitions just cited, but obviously anti-personnel landmines as another example, you know, it is quite applicable to nuclear weapons. We want to make nuclear weapons taboo. We want to make them not something that states talk about with a sense of pride, as you hear nuclear weapon states do, but something that they're embarrassed to possess, in the same way as we see chemical weapons discussed today. And, you know, if previous practice shows us anything, is that the existence of an international convention that prohibits them, it does have a huge impact on that kind of normative behavior. And so I think that's something that we take a lot of heart from, and it's something that it inspires us, in addition to the work done by those campaigns that establish those prohibitions on other weapons with unacceptable and inhumane impacts.